Good afternoon and welcome to the panel Artworks. It is a real pleasure and a privilege to be here today and to introduce a distinguished group of colleagues and friends. Public art is all about dialogue, and my job here is to get the dialogue started, so I've made a deal. All of their bios are online, and I am just going to introduce them so that the dialogue can begin and I don't take up any extra time, and there'll be more time for you to ask questions. So I'm going to begin with Randy Borscheit. Randy is president of the Alliance for the Arts, and following Randy is Lisa Phillips. Lisa is the director of the new Museum of Contemporary Art. She's been there since 1999. Thelma Golden is director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem. Ann Pasternak is president and artistic director of Creative Time. Ethel Schaefer is principal of Insights Associates, consultants in planning, land use, and community development. And finally, our moderator, Carol Rifkin. Carol is a filmmaker, activist, educator, and author. Carol, I turn the floor over to you, and I look forward to this conversation in public art and community. Thank you all very, very much.
And thank you all for being here. I'll give you the names again because you all came in the wrong order. But it was very thrilling to hear Susan Friedman's introduction because she's a child of the arts in New York and was involved in its very beginning. I'm also almost a child of the arts in New York, and I go back to the 70s thinking of New York City and the Soho district when I was a volunteer giving walking tours for Friends of Castana Architecture. And here was this dirty, disused district, and I would show the people on the tour, look, see those clean windows? There's an artist. Look, see those flower pots? There's an artist. And who would imagine the burgeoning of arts in this city since then? Who would ever have imagined the way arts has grown as a factor in livability and increasingly recognized as a factor in our economy? So we haven't mentioned money too much today, but it's underneath all of this arts panel in particular, and each of us will address it. We all came in the wrong order in the typical disorganized way of arts-related people, but I'll introduce the panel one by one, and you'll get a chance to get their names. And I should say that the panel, our discussion will be organized in three parts. The first part, you'll hear from these amazing people and the amazing contributions that their institutions are making to the viability and the vitality of the city, each in turn. And then, in a very serious vein, we'll look at the future and try to imagine that. And then I hope to allow plenty of time for audience participation, but I hope looking towards the future and with a creative eye and a spirit of enterprise that is what's going to make this city bigger and better and more vital than it's ever been. So for the first, I'm so proud to introduce Randy Borscheit, whose organization, the Alliance for the Arts, was one of the first to recognize that the arts are an industry, and they were an industry that was replacing manufacturing industry as early as the 70s. And the Alliance for the Arts has done an amazing job of spotlighting arts as an industry in New York, and the component organizations, the not-for-profit groups and the individual artists that go in, and civic leadership that go into that. So let's start with Randy Borscheit and hear his views on the arts infrastructure and what it is giving us. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. Okay. I'm going to start with, first of all, for those of you who are suffering conference fatigue, I sympathize. We'll try and be interesting, but I do have to share some numbers with you. As Carol says, my organization has had as part of its mission the task of reminding us, showing us that the arts are an industry, that this is one way to look at the arts, that the people in the arts industry have jobs, they are workers. You all know that, but not everyone in the city or the country knows that, and they need to be reminded and also just shown what it adds up to. I spend about half of my time apologizing for this research because some people think this means that I don't think art is about art. I'm actually quite interested in art for its own sake, but this is an important way to think of it and to talk about it, especially when you're speaking to our friends in the public policy sector, people in government. In these days, we have friends, we have a very sympathetic audience in the city council, in the mayor's office, the Department of Cultural Affairs, and so forth, but they need the numbers. So these are some of the numbers. Basically, the arts industry, and by our definition, we mean the commercial arts, Broadway, film and television production, commercial galleries and auction houses, as well as the nonprofit sector, spend about $12 billion a year. And they employ about 160,000 people. That $12 billion in spending is ripples through the economy. We all see it, the coffee shop around the corner from PS1 that's full on the weekends because people are coming to see shows, and there are many, many such examples. And through that ripple effect, the $12 billion in expenditures turns into a $21 billion economic impact. $8.2 billion in wages are paid, and quite interestingly, $900 million are paid in taxes to the city. If you think about what the Cultural Affairs Department provides in operating support for cultural organizations, which is now around $155 million, this is not a bad bargain for the city. And it's something for all of us to keep in mind, and it's something that people in government are well aware of and celebrate. It has a bearing also on another aspect of the city's role, and that is the capital budget. I'm going to talk about that again in a moment. Another aspect, and you may not be able to see the writing at the bottom, is that this $21 billion in economic impact includes about $7.5 billion generated by arts-motivated visitors. This is not every tourist in New York who happens to go to a museum or a play or a concert. It's our estimate, working with NYC and Company, of the number of visitors who are primarily here to enjoy the arts. And that's a phenomenon that's in one of the glories of New York. We have it in common, obviously, with other world cities. But it's something that we, again, all need to be aware of. And we need to understand that these arts-motivated visitors are among the most likely tourists to go off the beaten path, to find their way to Brooklyn, to find their way to Flushing, to find their way to Harlem, to Snug Harbor, and so forth. We'll go on to one more slide. This is just how those previous numbers are comprised. I hope you can read them. What it shows is that the nonprofit part of this industry accounts for almost a quarter of the economic impact. Arts-motivated visitors, the ones I was just talking about, are another quarter. About a third is attributable to film and motion picture and television production. Galleries and auction houses, 7%, and the commercial theater, 9%. If you add the galleries and auction houses and the commercial theater to the nonprofit sector, you see that the arts industry itself is a really important part of the city's economy. We've been trying to make that point, but since the very first report was done in 1983, a chart that I did not bring you, but I'll tell you, shows that beginning in 1983, stimulated in large part by the publication of that study, the budget of the Cultural Affairs Department, which was then only 3 or 4 years old, took off. It took a sympathetic mayor, a sympathetic legislature, but it took the support of a lot of members of the public and the press who fed off of this information and were able to use it. And in the following 10 years, the city saw a 300% increase in its cultural funding. We'll probably never see a spike quite like that. That's a sort of birth phenomenon. But it's very, very important to continue this understanding of the dynamics of the arts economy in order to maintain our strong relationship with government and with the private sector. When you look deeper into this industry, you see that in many cases, the arts organizations function as anchors of their communities. And this is often true whether they're a large institution or a small institution. It's true of the Bronx Zoo, which is the largest minority youth employer in the Bronx. It's true of the Brooklyn Academy of Music. It's equally true of the Studio Museum in Harlem or the Jamaica Arts Center and many, many other organizations. And the Bloomberg administration recently, in recognition of this, asked for proposals from community-based organizations that were at the heart of clusters to encourage them. There's a small amount of Economic Development Corporation money available for marketing clusters in all of the boroughs outside of the center. It's very much, I think, to their credit that they're thinking along those lines. Let's hope that when the economy rebounds, we can really do something dynamic in that area. Stung by the criticism that we only cared about dollars, we did some research going back almost a decade, but I think it's still quite relevant. There's an abundance of anecdotal evidence of this, and that was looking into the community impact of the arts. And we looked at organizations like the Jamaica Arts Center, which are very much a product of their community. Their audience is overwhelmingly drawn from the community. We surveyed members of that audience and found that 92% of them rated the arts and cultural activity in their community as extremely important. In fact, the Jamaica Arts Center was listed as an important cultural resource only after public safety and education and ahead of jobs, which amazed all of us. I think you can find that kind of phenomenon with well-established and brand new community-based organizations all over the city. And I really think that's the challenge and the opportunity ahead of us, and something that the summit can continue to focus on today and tomorrow, which is how do you transform a neighborhood by working with the energy that is already in that neighborhood, working with the artist community that's already in that neighborhood. And the last thing I'll say is that artists themselves are an incredibly important factor in this whole picture. They are not just the workforce of the arts industry, although they are, of course, essential to that. But they're a phenomenon in and of themselves, and they have certain behavioral patterns that we all enjoy and track. Flocking, they flocked, as we were saying earlier, they flocked to Soho. Before that, they were down by the Seaport and in other neighborhoods. And as I'm sure all of you know, they're all over neighborhoods in Brooklyn and the South Bronx and Harlem and lots of other parts of the city. And what they bring with them is a kind of energy that is reflected on the streets, but it's reflected in the communal life. And I'll just give you one example, and then I'll be quiet. One of my favorite little bars in town is Sonny's in Red Hook. If you go to Sonny's, which is just a bar, but has a great view of the harbor, there's always art by local artists on the gallery walls in the back room. There are readings of plays and poetry by local writers. and some of the best bluegrass and jazz music you can hear in town. And the audience is, the artists and the audience are mostly local people, but it attracts people from all around the city. It's a highly diverse audience. Anyway, not an advertisement for that particular bar, but I think you can find that kind of place in communities all around the city. And what they're doing, it's the Cedar Bar phenomenon. What they're doing is injecting the energy of artists into the communal life of the city.
Thank you, Randy. I mean, that's a really big stretch from how many hundreds of billions of dollars down to this bar in Red Hook. I like it. The New Museum for Contemporary Art pioneered Soho in a way that was internationally recognized, the way Soho emerged as an arts district like that, out of magic. And Lisa Phillips, director of the New Museum, is now pioneering, because the museum in its program and in its presence was a pioneer. And Lisa now has had this marvelous opportunity to pioneer, moving just a few blocks away, but a world away from Soho to the Bowery, in the relocation of the new museum and in reestablishing a relationship with artists and the public in that new location. So tell us how it's going.
Thank you. It's going very well. Oop, but that's not our slide. Okay. So this is the old Bowery, when the elevated train was on it. And we opened our building on the Bowery a little over 3 years ago. And this is the new Bowery, if you can see it. The museum was really instrumental in effecting a major transformation of this street, of the neighborhood, of the Bowery, which has now become almost a neighborhood unto itself. And even when we announced that we were going to move there from Broadway to the Bowery, it precipitated just a rush of interest in the street, in the properties, and now we have this wonderful dynamic mix of restaurants and hotels, shops, nonprofits, galleries, and other kinds of organizations that are up and down the street. So it's been really wonderful to be part of the transformation of a neighborhood like the Bowery. We were attracted to it initially because it was a languishing place. It was a kind of shady interzone that people felt uncomfortable passing. It was almost a barrier to the Lower East Side, which was developing, Nolita on the other side. It was this funny threshold that people just didn't want to look at. It was a place that people avoided. So we were interested in that challenge, much as we had been earlier by Broadway when it was a light industrial district and really helped to transform Broadway. So our board, to a person, was really enthusiastic about the Bowery as the right location for the new museum. And as Carol said, it psychologically was such a long distance away, even though it was 4 short blocks away. It was another world. And the other thing about the Bowery, though, is that artists have long understood the charms of the Bowery, the 6-lane wide street that affords great light, and the large loft buildings that line the Bowery provide great space. So artists, as Randy said, are the original pioneers always. And they also are the ones that begin the process of gentrification too, but then are themselves often, shut out as that process goes on. It's an irony, and it's something that we have to think about very hard, how to preserve those communities, how to, or just accept that they keep moving on. But it's at a critical point right now in the city, I think. So we also felt in doing the design of this building, and it was our first freestanding structure, that we wanted to be, we wanted it to broadcast our spirit of being dynamic and open, but we also wanted to give an architecture firm their first chance to build in New York, and that's consistent with our mission of showing artists first and being a platform for new art and new ideas. So we also, as part of our brief, wanted the architects to address the neighborhood and address the street and address the community. So we wanted to be open to the community, and we wanted the architecture to be open. We also wanted it to fit in with the street, which is a rough street. And, you know, it does, full of restaurant supply stores, et cetera. So one of the firms made their presentation, and they showed this slide, and this is what won them the competition.
Lisa, you can see the slide up there.
No, I don't see that far.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, this is the building if it were just a typical building in New York, and it was maximizing the footprint and building all the square footage allowed. And then, so you can see what happens when the floors are pulled apart and it's opened up. And we just thought that was a brilliant device, nothing that we'd seen before. This is the building as it stands today. It looks quite different from that initial proposal, but the floors are all shifted, and it is very open. Light comes in everywhere, and I don't know if you can see, the ground floor is really, the lobby is an extension of the street. So it does have that open and dynamic quality. So the museum also has much expanded facilities in its new location. It has a theater. We present over 300 events a year in the theater, and that ranges from new music to new media to dance, performance art, film, and roundtables and lectures like these. And these bring in really diverse audiences. Our audience in general has expanded from what was 80,000 a year to, in our first year of operation, 500,000. And that, of course, has brought tremendous activity to the street and the surrounding neighborhood, where we've now become a hub for the whole community, and we have created maps that show the 60 or so galleries that have sprung up around us, and restaurants and other things that people can do while they're there. It's really become now a destination in itself. So challenges for the future, we have a responsibility now as a...
You want to hold that to keep it a discussion? All of
Sure.
us do it as a second part, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. No, there's more to come, but,
Yeah, okay.
but just in closing, I want to say that we have a responsibility now as a new member of this community to both think about our new role in it and how we're affecting it. Obviously, we've been a great agent of change, and most of it, I think, has been positive, but we're very aware, too, of the effects of gentrification and what happens when development goes out of control. And so we're really interested in looking at how one can help to be a place for discussion about responsible development in the city, and arts organizations' role in that, and artists' role in that. So I'll end there.
I think that, I'm sorry I interrupted you, Lisa,
It's okay.
because it is fascinating to think of how powerful a change agent a cultural institution is. It is extraordinary. I think Thelma Golden at the Studio Museum, the museums have a lot in common, and also a lot that's different, mostly like 125 blocks. That makes them very different. And it's very interesting that I think at the Studio Museum, that museum has been an important element for stability and positive growth of that neighborhood. And they've gone hand in hand over the years. And interestingly now, with the development of globalization in the art world, that the Studio Museum has gone from its roots and its Harlem legacy now to looking for international connections to the African community, and beyond the frontiers of the local area. So it's a fascinating thing, and we look forward to hearing what Thelma Golden has to say.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. It's great to be able to think about and talk about the Studio Museum in Harlem. It's an honor to be on this panel, and also an honor to be in the room with a former director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, Kinshasa Holman Conwill. So, exactly, yes. So I am speaking about a history and a legacy that I am very proud to be a part of. So Carol, you posed a question to us, which was quite simply, how has the museum affected the community, and how has the community affected the museum? And in many ways, I realized that the esteemed founders of the Studio Museum in Harlem, obviously 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, knew you were going to ask me that question, because in many ways, the name of the museum sort of answers it. The way in which they thought to name the Studio Museum was very much in looking at how this institution would affect a community already existing, but also how it would be affected by it. When the choice of the name came about, it was sort of simple and succinct in trying to define and broadcast in a very real way what the aspiration of the institution was. So in some ways, I can say that the answers to your question is that there's an interchange here. The community and the museum respond. I'm sorry, I have slides. I forgot about that. It's a work from our collection. Jacob Lawrence is the architect from 1959, thought appropriate to this environment today. But before I get to how the museum affects the community and how the community affects the museum, I have to sort of think about and tell you all a little bit about what I have come to call the sort of preposition problematic. And that is, our name is the Studio Museum in Harlem. But at least 400 times a day, we are called the Studio Museum of Harlem. And it's always a big dilemma for me. Do I correct people and sound like some kind of grammar cop, you know, because they look at me sometimes like that's what I said? Or do I point out why the distinction is significant, which then sounds in some ways like I'm really splitting hairs? But really, it is in that constantly that I think about how this question of how the community affects the museum and how the museum affects the community comes out. Because as the Studio Museum in Harlem, we also work hard and strive to be of Harlem. The museum, of course, affects the community, as you said, Carol, because we were founded really to be a community anchor, to be a part of a community which at that time was reimagining itself, and imagining itself both as it related to its past, but also thinking about its future. The In Harlem was, in many ways, to sort of think about citing the institution very specifically within an important community history. How the community, though, has affected the institution is that our mission and our mandate, which is to show artists of African descent, locally, nationally, and internationally, also really speaks to the dynamic change that has happened in the community, the dynamic change of a community that cited itself in many ways as the heart of this nation's African-American community, but always saw itself in relation to the African diaspora, but now, in many ways, begins to re-understand itself through the profoundly changing demographics of not only the Black community as it exists in New York and in this country and in the world, but of the New York community, of which Harlem now is very much a part of when we talk about change. When I imagine that in our name, this idea of the studio was, of course, to signal the fact that in Harlem's past, we were, of course, the home of the Harlem Renaissance, a pioneering movement which definitive in terms of its relationship to Black modernism, but also really defined the community as a space in which artists were leaders, working hand in hand with civic leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, very much at the heart of defining and speaking for the community, which lasted in the Harlem community, even lasts to this day. The museum, of course, is really what we are, a repository, an institution that is looking, on the one hand, to offer the possibility of the presentation of work by artists of African descent, but also to stand in this position of thinking about the community as it changes. These are, I should just go back, views. This is the original building of the Studio Museum in Harlem, which was on 5th Avenue between 125th and 126th Street, located, as you see, next to the liquor store. And on your, I guess that's your left, an image of the museum circa, this would actually be circa 79 through about 1990, a rendering of the renovation initiated by Kinshasa Conwill that then leads to our present. Now, where we are, you know, often when we think about geography, 125th Street is an amazing place to site a cultural institution, a street which really in many ways defines Harlem here in sort of 4 different manifestations of how Harlem can be understood as a cultural center, as the great center of commerce, also though one prototypically involved in thinking about what Harlem is, and then also at the heart of our major change. In imagining, however, also how we sit in the community, it's also thinking about change in its most extreme way, and that is to think about gentrification, to think about how arts can transform a community, but often a community can transform beyond the arts. Beyond, that's your future, which I won't speak about, but beyond that. I show you here a project that was created for an exhibition that I organized when I was chief curator at the Studio Museum in 2004 called Harlem World, Community as Metaphor. And this is a work by the architect Ron Norsworthy, where he imagined a replacement to our esteemed state office building. And if you've been on 125th Street, know that we sit across. You notice it's not in any of the slides I've shown you. But we sit across from the state office building, sort of behemoth of a building, sort of lording over us all. And in this exhibition where I commissioned 26 emerging architects of African descent to imagine Harlem in however they would see it in its present or its future, Ron Norsworthy took on this idea of not just gentrification, but an idea of community transformation and replaced the state office building, raised it literally, and created this building which he called Reparation Tower, which was looked at as an answer, of course, to all that has happened in the community, not just architecturally, but the way in which these architectural changes have signaled changes to the fabric and the fiber of the culture. And here's where we are now. So really, more than anything, I would say in thinking about how an institution can create place, be involved in placemaking, or more significantly, how places can define an institution, our role, I think, in Harlem now is to be a part of the redefinition. Not necessarily to lead it, but be responsive to what is continuing to be the dynamic growth and reinvention of a community that has always, at its heart, been thinking about itself at one moment in its past, looking at its history, the sort of self-reflection at the past, but also always thinking about its future, the promise and the possibility. And as an arts institution, with artists as our partners, we feel privileged to be a part of that ongoing growth. Thank you.
Ann Pasternak is head of Creative Time. This absolutely amazing organization that enables us to see the city in new ways with a sense of wonder and discovery, and it just kind of creates the creative spark as something that's ours. I think by putting art out in the amazing way that Creative Time does, Creative Time does, I think it's so New York in the sense of we can have this sense of discovery and wonder. Through the years, and all these institutions, you're aware, date really back to the 70s. You know, this is all the power of the arts to grow and nourish and nurture. And Creative Time, since Art on the Beach to this newest project that Anne has me totally intrigued about, have sustained the sense of wonder over all these years. So do you want to talk about it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Before we get there, I'm just curious, without looking at your program, how many of you remember the title of this panel? Oh, it's right behind me? Oh, wait. Okay, now how many of you remember? So artworks, and you know, I have artwork hanging on my wall above my sofa. Yes, we have artwork, but art works. And some of you may know that that is the new tagline for the National Endowment for the Arts, thanks to our friend Rocco Landisman. And since we're talking about the impact on arts in our city and on our world, I wanted to thank Randy for his leadership nationally in terms of measuring the impact of the arts. The NEA picked up suit a few years ago to try to look at national numbers, and I thought I'd share a few other numbers with you. Ready? So, did you know that nearly people who participate in the arts are nearly 2 times as likely to exercise? That's right, we're jocks. And that people in the arts who participate in the arts are nearly 2 times as likely to participate in outdoor activities like hiking and jogging and canoeing and whatever people do outdoors. I'm clearly not one of them. And that children who have arts classes do better on their SATs. There's some good data out there. So, you know, Randy, I just wanted to acknowledge your data and add a little of my own. At any rate, so you know, the arts are good for us economically and they're good for our society, and people who participate in the arts are more likely to vote and to go to church and to volunteer. Actually, in a big way, they're much more likely to volunteer. So it's really good for our society. But artists are also participating in our communities. And so I was asked to share just an example of a way that an artist is making an impact on a community. And there are lots of examples that Susie could give or I could give, but I just thought I'd show you my most recent project. Did anybody here participate in the Key to the City project? Yay, I know you did. Just a few of you. And I know you did. Well, it's a little incestuous. She hired me at Creative Time. So with Randy, that's right. It's very incestuous. So thank you guys. I still love my job and owe you my lives. That's right. No, it's not the bar at Red Hook. So anyway, this is the artist Paul Rammer's Jonas. And Paul had this idea. How do you make a big public monument that people can contribute to by having a little piece of it? That the sum of all the participants is greater sort of than the whole. And the idea was to work with this idea of the key to the city. Now normally, you know, the mayor gives the key to the city to a dignitary like the Dalai Lama, or when the Yankees win the World Series in 2010, they'll again get the key to the city. So, so that's all fine and good, but he thought, you know, everyday citizens in New York are also doing profound good in their own communities, their workplaces, schools, et cetera, their families. Why not give a key to the city to everyday New Yorkers? And so thanks to our mayor, Paul Rammer's Jonas's Key to the City became the official key to New York in the month of June. And what we did is we set up a commons in the heart of Times Square. And people came to bestow on one another, like a mother to a son, 2 co-workers, a teacher to a student. They'd come to Times Square and they'd bestow the key to the city on one another. And for all very interesting reasons, which I won't share any of them here, but I was privileged for about 3 weeks to help with bestowal ceremonies, and I learned a lot about people. So anyway, here's Paul with our mayor. And now this key to the city is not just a symbolic key to the city. It actually opens 24 sites in all 5 boroughs. If you showed your key at the in Staten Island at Fresh Kills Landfill, you could get a special tour bus to take you on a tour of Fresh Kills Landfill, and you had the added benefit of having your own set of binoculars. Likewise, you could turn on a street lamp in Bryant Park, turn a light on and off. I mean, we're surrounded by street lamps, right? How often do we get to turn one on and off? But the project also had really wonderful impact on local businesses. So for example, in Queens, near Flushing, there's a taqueria that the city introduced us to, in fact, called Nick's Mall. And they're very famous because apparently they're revered because they're the only ones who still make their own handmade corn tortillas as opposed to flour tortillas, something like that. At any rate, so we thought if like maybe 3 people went to go visit some of these places because they really weren't near subway stops or bus lines, we would be very blessed. And in fact, over 1,000 people went to this restaurant, for example. And when they got to the restaurant and they showed their key to the city, they were brought down into the kitchen to see how they make these corn tortillas. And they were so grateful for all these people coming to their little neighborhood restaurant that they ask people to sign the door. So when you go to the restaurant, I wonder if actually we have an image of it. Yeah, there you see it. Oh, you can't really see it, but if you turned around, you could. There are now literally over 1,000 people having signed the door. We asked them if we could replace their door and have the door for the archive, but they're very proud of it. Or Eddie's Sweet Shop. For example, if you showed your key to the city, they'd give you an extra scoop of ice cream. But what was so wonderful is that people loved leaving messages wherever they went. So every day we actually had to have somebody go to the Bryant Park street light and remove all the letters and messages that people left behind. And so it became this very participatory kind of project. Let's see if we have other images. Yep, more signing of the door. Apparently we like that one a lot. Post box. People left things. One of the really wonderful stories about this is that we started capturing tweets and Facebook, information and Flickr that people were having engaged communication, social networking about this project. And it was really interesting to learn that we thought, 24 sites, all 5 boroughs, maybe there'll be 3 freaks in New York City who would actually go to all 24 sites. Turned out it was actually hundreds and hundreds of people. They made it their free summertime activity. Not everybody gets to go to the Hamptons or Aspen during the summer, apparently. So, so people made this their summer activity. It brought a lot of tourists to the city to engage the city in a way that was quite different from what they perhaps normally would have been able to do. Oh, I just lost my train of thought about that. It was really great. Oh, so the tweets, one of the great stories, and some of you may have seen this in the New York Times, was that this one attorney in New York had been living in the city for about 5 years, fell in love with New York. She said that New York was her husband, but it was time to actually start a real relationship with a living, breathing human male. And so she started a blog. Anybody see that movie, Julia and Julia? It was kind of like her own version of that, right? And so she started this blog that she would have a first date with somebody at each of the key to the city locations. And because we were capturing tweets, the New York Times ended up covering it. She got a movie deal. It's all good. Yeah. All right, so anyway, there are just lots, the point is there are lots of ways that artists are participating in our communities. They're working with educating our kids in community centers and in our public schools as well as our private schools. They're, making work for our institutions. They're making interventions, whether it's street art or some other kind of interventions within our city in all 5 boroughs, and they're making the city a much more interesting, dynamic, livable, wondrous place. And at the same time, they're also having a real impact on the businesses in our city.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Ethel Sheffer reminds me that she's a gadfly. Ethel has been involved as a professional planner and as a person who's involved in community action for a long time in many, many places in the city. So I think it was good to put Ethel at her place in the panel to help us look with a different perspective on artworks and community.
Thank you very much, Carol. As the cleanup hitter and the non-artist here, the planner, I thought I would just try to summarize a little bit some of what's been going on here at the Summit and bring together a little bit of Jane Jacobs in planning and the creative community and just describe briefly some of the connections and similarities that I really think have been exemplified by the people here today. And then also briefly, and I didn't plan this, but I've been listening carefully, develop a little metaphor of the different types of arts organizations and how they grow in New York, and all in the short time, and with what I think are really some of the challenges that maybe we can deal with when Carol comes to it. And first, I want to start with, of course, our mother planner, namely Jane Jacobs, whom we remember, we know each day, and in the last panel, glorified large cities with their mix of uses and the diversity and so on, and the physical density and the population. But she also glorified the large city because it was conducive to the development of the small niche enterprise of many kinds, including the arts. And that complexity promoted diversity, not in a slogan way, but in terms of creativity as well. And of course, she was the person who, in many, many ways, described the clustering of many uses, of which, of course, arts clustering are most important in the subject of this panel. She didn't like planners because they tended to impose patterns and rules from the outside. For this great writer, Jane Jacobs, one size fits all was a no-no. And so then if we shift to the arts and cultural organizations, especially those trying to find a home, those who have flourished in New York in a lot of different physical and social settings, in which the phrase, which I happen to like, where it's so important for artists to be engaged in have the proximity of differences, to be close to a lot of different kinds of people and ideas, and where in another, I think, important book written by Elizabeth Currid, and she calls it The Warhol Economy, how New York, how fashion, art, and music drives New York, she makes the point that creative people and artists and institutions flourish because they can meet with each other. Even in this era of social media, the face-to-face, the exchange of ideas, the clustering of clubs, galleries, theaters, restaurants, everything that was described in so many different ways by these creative people, that they set the trends, but they also are given the opportunity, and I'm really going to emphasize this, so I know the economics are critical, that to be creative in ways that we, many of us, and the planners can't always anticipate. So one size fits all doesn't work in the creative community either, and that's part of what we have to continue to work with in New York. As to my metaphor, which about different kinds of organizations and communities, it's not original with me, but I'm going to give it to you because I think it's really helpful, and I realize a number of the people here exemplify. And the first in the metaphor is to think, the metaphor has to do with a tree or plants, and I'm thinking first of the seedling, and the seedling in which a few friends or like-minded people find the space for a gallery, or, as in the case of Symphony Space, which I know a lot about, or in the case of a defunct movie theater, in a very vital neighborhood, but which was considered down and out in the 70s in the Upper West Side, a few people, a few strange people, a few quirky people, but they together rescued the movie theater, engage in a very strange event, namely a free event in which musicians from the neighborhood and elsewhere came and played Bach for 12 hours, and at the end of the day, 6,000 people had arrived, and from there, and a lot of hard work and court cases and you name it, came a development project. And so the seedling, like Symphony Space, is one example in which they then placed roots in the community, and of course, Thelma is very well, and all have described the Studio Museum and what this has meant to Harlem as another example. Both in different ways look for the community for support in the struggle so that they grow to become citywide organizations, but they are still in the community. At the other end of the spectrum, my metaphor, is what is the mighty oak. And the mighty oak, not in New York, an example could be, I don't know, the Guthrie Theater originally in Minneapolis to try to, an empty land, try to revive, had funding and so on, and try to build a community. Another one, of course, is our own Lincoln Center. The mighty oak came, raised a community, and brought an art center, and in many ways, in my view, is beginning to find that it should come back to its surrounding community as well as be a city organization. But the mighty oak is in some ways an example of almost any plan from government and sometimes from the so-called private-public ventures to step in, create an arts organization from scratch, and that somehow is going to redevelop. But now as we're looking to the redevelopment of Lower Manhattan and of course of Ground Zero, And after so many years, perhaps soon, well, it won't be so soon, we may be able to see a performing arts center there, and it would be wonderful if it could be the Joyce, which has had its roots. But I have always been concerned, and I think the history shows that to state as a plan that we're going to develop a performing arts center, a big one, and there's no provision made for support for that organization, for the infrastructure, all of that leads to some questions. And last, one other example about the mighty oaks. Sometimes the seedlings become the mighty oaks. And I would say in the case of BAM has become a mighty oak. It was a seedling, and it's taken maybe a century in its incarnations, but it is that. And the last part of my metaphor, in between the two, of the seedling and the mighty oak, we have the sapling, the arts enterprise that grows to a certain size, has experience and support and roots, and can be transplanted as part of revitalization without sacrificing those assets and identity. And if I may say, I think the new museum is perhaps an example of that. I hope that the Joyce will be. So lastly, and maybe moving to the future, in everything that's been said here by all who have been laboring and working in the trenches, and I as a planner and a person who's been the gadfly and community activist, I have to raise the serious questions about the conflicts, the opportunities between pioneering, gentrification, and the economic market. I will not repeat, of course, because it's so well told, the story of Soho. Everybody knows it, but from the 70s, with the ignored cast iron buildings and the decline of manufacturing, only Margot Gale knew that they were not to be ignored. The pioneers came, and they made something of it, but they were displaced by, in some cases, wealthier artists, and frequently after that by stockbrokers, attorneys, and others who might have wanted to live near the arts but helped to displace it. And the galleries and others were displaced by chain stores and many other things. So we have to watch this. So one more minute. Artists are the bellwether of reinvestment. Do they signal it? Can they foster economic growth, or do they succumb, not just by a natural migration, but do they succumb in a kind of economic Darwinism of the marketplace? So we know in New York, and New York's terrific because it's big also, and from Soho, artists and others have, the East Village and Dumbo and Williamsburg and Bushwick, and we can plot those for the vitality, but we can also plot changes and some homogenization. But there are the positive examples, and I want to end my part on that. There are some terrific examples, I think, in New York. Being the planner, I'm also a big believer in don't plan everything, but have the imagination and the improvisation and have the creativity occur, and then help after that. So one example, perhaps, is that in the displacement of art galleries and so on, I don't know that any of us, I wouldn't have, could have predicted that art galleries would go to the vertical buildings in factory in Chelsea, and that you could go to, and that eventually people would visit art galleries by taking elevators up 10 floors, and that it would become an important place and a place where many residents and visitors could go. A good thing, I think, about what occurred in Chelsea through creativity and using the buildings was that then the city did recognize something, and they engaged in a government action to protect Chelsea. So, and the High Line's another example, but I think there are both opportunities, but really serious issues for this city and other cities to look at.
Thank you. There's a couple of big issues that I kind of want to put on the table and see what the panel picks up on or the audience picks up on if we have time. And they're issues that came out of this morning and that we live with every day. So the big question is, what's the outlook for the future? What do you think is going to happen with respect to the arts and livability? But the issues I wanted to put out there Number one, diversity. We looked at the population statistics, the predictions of the composition of our city in 10, 20, 40 years, and I look around at this audience and at the cultural institutions that are active today, and I ask myself, and I think everyone must be thinking about it, what will be the institutions that will lead New York's new demography? You know, what will be the collaborations? What will be the know-how and energy that will pass this leadership on to new populations? That was very vivid this morning. The second one, which is only going to be a word, two words that I'm going to say, and you can imagine the implications because it's what every New Yorker really is born in, that's real estate. Real estate with a population now of 9 million people down the line, for the city that for many, many years was 7 million, what are the implications of that for future arts activities? And the third is finance, money. Will, in this age of economic constraints, you know, where are these leaps forward going to happen? So the question is, whenever you want to take it up, and in a very short time that we have, what's the future? So let's start just in the middle with Thelma. Or whoever wants to. Thelma, do you want to? Yeah.
Well, I'll say, as it relates to the changing demographics, I think that the future is going to have to involve some redefinition, reinterpretation of what we now call the community-based arts. I think that in some ways that term needs to be eradicated. And we need to allow for the idea of culture and communities to exist in a new paradigm that does not position certain institutions as being sort of citywide and sort of general, and others as being community-based, and having that be unequal in its role. I think with the changing demographics, we are going to see a whole new group of cultural institutions, but in some cases that are being built and designed in very different ways than the model that some of our own institutions were built from in the 70s. And I think not only our language, but our, to money, the nature of support will have to change to allow that.
That's a fundamental mindset difference. Mm-hmm. That's a fundamental mindset. Who else?
I'd like to answer a couple of your questions. One, New York is really known for its cultural capital. That's what makes this city great. And we all have a big job to do to make that wider known. I know that's been your mission, but people need to know more about the statistics and actually what arts are doing for the city. Wherever I travel, people say, I go to New York because of the diversity of creativity that's there. That's number one. Number two is that, I forget what number two is. You take it over.
Okay. You want to take a shot at it?
What is number? Remind me of number two. I'm sorry.
Oh no, the real estate finance. I mean, of the issues.
Oh, number two is this. Okay, I just remembered. So, sorry. There are lots of really important activities that are going on a guerrilla basis, sort of on just a grassroots basis. People are taking matters into their own hands, and they're doing amazing things. This is part of the future, for sure. It's already happening. It's always happened, and it will continue to happen. Artists are part of that, other community activist groups. But three, just in relation to number one, is that the city needs, and this administration has been great, they need to recognize the importance of arts and that this is Art City, and to really create incentives to keep the diversity alive and keep this a vibrant creative center, or it will move elsewhere. And we have a big responsibility there too. That's all I'm saying.
Great,
Okay.
great.
I would also add, in terms of diversity, that our institutions need to do a much better job at mentoring professionals of different walks of life within their institutions and create programming on a continuous basis that engages the diversity of New York City. I do not think we do a good job of that.
Deputy Mayor Harris this morning referred to the fact that the system for allocating funding in the Cultural Affairs Department had been changed, reformed a few years ago, and expanded somewhat. Now, It's not expanding at the moment for economic reasons. But the idea behind it, I think, is full of possibility. It created it opened a much wider door to the possibility of city funding, including to organizations that were fairly new. There's, I believe, still a requirement that you have to have been in existence for 3 years. But what we're seeing, and Anne alluded to it, is, and I think we all see it, is a lot of unincorporated activity. It's always been the case, but it seems to me this is a golden age of that activity. It's partly born of necessity, but what we have the obligation to do, and this goes also to Anne's point about mentoring, is to guide the people who are engaged in this activity and show them the possibility of creating organizations, if that is their wish. And then once that happens, to guide them in the early stages of building organizations, finding appropriate funding, and so forth. I often think that, and I'm reminded of every time I go to Berlin, that one of the most important things that especially local government can do in supporting the arts is to get out of the way. Let them squat, let them do their own thing. Hard to put that into policy, but
I think so too, but I think there are some things that maybe we have to think about with government. This may be not the time to say it, but government in New York and elsewhere has continued to provide incentives to keep the financial sector here, to keep corporations here, and we may have to find a way, even in straitened times, to have incentives to keep the artist, whether the artist who lives here and doesn't have a place to live because it's expensive, and I know that comes in conflict with many other groups who also can't afford it, but to permit the smaller theater or the smaller gallery not to have to be displaced by the real estate. Secondly, the adage live, work, play. The combination live, work, play, I mean, that is the way cities function now. It isn't always a separation of uses. And so I think there has to be a number of ways, whether it's helping to subsidize or even create, is this bad to say, new Westbeths appropriate to the way people are living and working now, and to foster that. And the last thing, I'm wary of, you need the private sector, but don't automatically develop something and say, developer, you put some arts organization in your building. It's artificial if it isn't integrated in the community, if there isn't going to be the government help, and so we've got to watch that. But on 125th Street, I think I don't know how it's working out, but I think that one good city policy, at least to think about for the future, is that there's all sorts of new zoning, which is considered gentrifying by some and vital by others, but one provision is if there's new buildings, there has to be a provision of 5% at the sidewalk level of floor area for its entertainment arts. So I don't know if it's going to work out, but I'd like us to look at it and see if we can't do more of that. That would provide for the tensions and make the connections between real estate and arts and creativity.
I love it. We're out of time. I need a marching order. I have two possibilities. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but I know we're out of time, so I want to tell you there is a website that you can, and here's what I would particularly want if we had, we have no time to take the audience, right? We're over. So I apologize, but you do have an opportunity to write your great ideas to mas.org. And write that as a follow-up, as your ticket that you still have yet to pay for in the conference. What are your great ideas, that, such as the panel has come up with, to make arts help the city be more livable? So we look forward to a continued conversation, and I thank you so much for your presence and your attention.